This message comes to you from King's Church Wirral, UK. We hope that as you listen, you will be encouraged, blessed and inspired.
Hello, welcome to this teaching from King's Church Wirral. We are continuing our teaching series today through the book of Joshua and reaching the end of the first section of this book. We can roughly divide Joshua into two sections, the first 13 chapters dealing with the taking of the land and the battle under the lead of Joshua and Yahweh, and then the remaining 11 chapters dealing with the apportioning of the land to the people of Israel. Last week we heard about how Joshua and Israel conquered the southern kingdoms and defeated their kings. As we arrive in this passage, we find that we are now in the place that Israel are now the dominant landowners of the Promised Land. In a few short chapters they've gone from desert wanderers who crossed the Jordan and took Jericho to rulers of the whole of southern Canaan. City after city and king after king have fallen as the people move in to take occupation of the land God has given them. They will no longer be seen as a weak nation. They are no longer being underestimated by the native kings. Israel is now seen as a major threat and a big player in the land. It is in these circumstances that we arrive at chapter 11. It says this: When Jabin, king of Hazor, heard this, he sent word to Jobab, king of Madon, to the kings of Shimron and Axphar, and to the northern kings who were in the mountains, in the Arabah, south of Kinnereth, in the western foothills, and in Naphoth Dor on the west, to the Canaanites in the east and the west, to the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, and Jebusites in the hill country, and to the Hivites below Hermon in the region of Mizpah. They came out with all their troops and a large number of horses and chariots, a huge army, as numerous as the sand on the seashore. All these kings joined forces and made camp together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. So, as I said, no longer seen as the newbies. In fact, very clearly to be considered to be a threat the likes of which the northern cities had never seen. Many of these northern strongholds were smaller and less fortified than their southern counterparts, so the fall of the southern cities and kings, even when they were in an allegiance with one another, would have caused great fear among these northern cities. Seems like nothing unites a people like a common enemy. And here the northern cities have a serious common enemy. These cities were not at war with one another, but neither were they one nation. 14 named regions are included in this union, with many more cities and kings being present than are directly named. The historian who wrote down Joshua invokes an ancient saying at this point. He says that this enemy, this army that Israel are facing, was as numerous as the sand on the seashore. Now we will recognise this language from the covenant that God made with Abraham. But in the ancient world, this was just a way of saying a very large number of people. Then the chapter goes on to describe the victory that Israel gets. It says, The Lord said to Joshua, Do not be afraid, because by this time tomorrow I will hand all of them, slain, over to Israel. You are to hamstring their horses and burn their chariots. So Joshua and his whole army came against them suddenly at the waters of Merom and attacked them, and the Lord gave them into the hand of Israel. They defeated them and pursued them all the way to Greater Sidon, to Misrephoth Maim, and to the valley of Mizpah on the east, until no survivors were left. Joshua did to them as the Lord had directed. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots. At that time, Joshua turned back and captured Hazor and put its king to the sword, because Hazor had been the head of all these kingdoms. Everyone in it they put to the sword. They totally destroyed them, not sparing anyone that breathed, and he burned Hazor itself. Joshua took all these royal cities and their kings and put them to the sword. He He totally destroyed them, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. Yet Israel did not burn any of the cities built on their mounds, except Hazor, which Joshua burned. The Israelites carried off for themselves all the plunder and livestock of these cities, but all the people they put to the sword until they completely destroyed them, not sparing anyone that breathed. As the Lord commanded his servant Moses, so Moses commanded Joshua, and Joshua did it. He left nothing undone of all the Lord commanded Moses. So Joshua took the entire land, the hill country, all the Negev, the whole region of Goshen, the western foothills, the Arabah, and the mountains of Israel with their foothills, from Mount Halak, which rises towards Seir, to Baal Gad in the valley of Lebanon, below Mount Hermon. He captured all their kings and put them to death. Joshua waged war against all these kings for a long time. Except for the Hivites living in Gibeon, not one city made a peace treaty with the Israelites, who took them all in battle. For it was the Lord himself who hardened their hearts to wage war against Israel, so that he might destroy them totally, exterminating them without mercy, as the Lord had commanded Moses. At that time Joshua went and destroyed the Anakites from the hill country, from Hebron, Debir, and Anab, from all the hill country of Judah, from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua totally destroyed them and their towns. No Anakites were left in Israelite territory. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did any survive. So Joshua took the entire land, just as the Lord had directed Moses, and he gave it as an inheritance to Israel, according to their tribal divisions. Then the land had rest from war. There it is. Joshua took the entire land as the Lord had directed Moses. And as we read this passage, I just think there's a couple of really important truths that need to be drawn out that we can learn from the way God directs the people of Israel through this taking of the northern cities. The first is this. Having read Joshua up to this point, you might be mistaken for thinking that the only means by which the people of Israel will win anything in battle is through the supernatural, miraculous intervention of Yahweh. Whether it is the battle with the Jordan, where God parted the waters, the battle of Jericho, where God brought down the wall, or the battle of Gibeon, where hail rained down from the sky, it seems that God brings victory to his people via his own methods. We looked at this back in chapter 10, when really the message from chapter 10 came out of being that God wins the battle supernaturally, but he wants his people present with him. And that is certainly true. Now, if you're anything like me, the same message still seems to be presented. When we hear testimonies given in meetings of the goodness of God, when we ask for testimony, they will very often revolve around God's miraculous move. The actions of God when he does something that is utterly outside of our working. Healings, divine answers to prayer, actions are outside the normal daily activity. We might be able to say that we are guilty, really sometimes, maybe, of only recognising the work of God when we see no earthly mechanism by which something came to be. But this chapter points to another way that God brings about victory for his people. That of obedience to his ways. When the southern kings were beaten in battle, hail rained down from the sky and killed them as they fled. But no such miracle on the northern kings. Joshua and the people of Israel were victorious in battle because they were obedient to God. They put the northern kings to the sword as God commanded. They burned all the cities as God commanded. They hamstrung the horses and burned the chariots as God commanded. And this obedience led to the Lord giving them the victory. Now, to be clear, the victory was still God's. It was just that it was won through the obedience of the people who acted in faith to the commands of God, rather than via a separate, disconnected action of an all-powerful God. God won the battle for Israel through Israel's obedience to God. Now, this is an important thing for us to understand about God working in us. He will use the miraculous. He will do amazing things. He will do inexplainable things. And it is right and proper to recognise God acts that way and to give testimony to those things when we see them. But we must not think that this is the only way that God will bring victory to us. Neither necessarily is there some pattern or formula to know what God might do in any place. Let's give you an example. Let's say you're not seeing victory in finance. Now, I don't mean by not victory in finance. I'm not talking about being rolling in cash with like 3 Ferraris on the driveway. I'm just talking about basic daily provision. Let's say you're not in a position where you can say, I'm living in the goodness of God when it comes to my finances. You know, God could supernaturally provide you with the means by which to pay your bills and clear your debts. It could be a miracle of provision pushed through the letterbox, or a windfall of some description comes at just the right time. God is capable of doing that, and God does work that way. And if that were to happen, it is so important to testify to the goodness of God for his provision. When God moves and blesses, it is right to let people know so that God can be glorified. Because victory has come from God through the miraculous. But God could equally bring about victory and financial relief through your obedience, teaching you to live within your means, dealing with long-term debt, guiding you and speaking to you about what you spend your money on and why. And over time, through obedience to God, you reach a point of being debt-free and within your means. And it is right to give glory to God for that too. Victory from God through obedience. Or maybe you can make a similar argument for health. That you may be unhealthy in some way, defeated and put down in terms of your physical health. Perhaps you're overweight or a smoker or have drug problems. And you know there are testimonies out there of God moving supernaturally to break addiction, to relieve smoking cravings, or even to cause weight loss and restoration of health. And God does these things. And when he does it, it is right to give him glory for it, to testify to it, because it is victory from God through the miraculous. But God could equally bring about victory in your health by directing you and you walking in obedience to him, telling you to eat healthier, seek help for a smoking addiction, break ties with drug suppliers, live in healthy community, open yourself up to oversight, counsel and accountability. And in doing so, God brings you into health. And it is right to give God glory for that too, because it is victory from God through obedience. You see, in this passage, victory comes through obedience, not the miraculous as we have seen previously in Joshua. It's not to say it's not a miracle, and it's not to say that it is not the movement of God, because it is. But it is to say that the actual victory was won in the hands of the people, rather than in spite of the people. God worked even more, in this passage, God worked even more with Israel, rather than exclusively for Israel. So that's one thing I want to draw out of this passage, that victory can come through obedience. But the other is this. I'd like to pick up on another point mentioned in this chapter. It's found in the instruction given to Joshua in verse 6. And it's then backed up with Joshua's obedience to the instruction found in verse 9. In verse 6 it says this: "The Lord said to Joshua, do not be afraid of them, because by this time tomorrow I will hand all of them slain over to Israel. You are to hamstring their horses and burn their chariots." And then in verse 9 it says, "Joshua did to them as the Lord had directed. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots." Now, To an exterior observer, this way of dealing with the horses might seem like nothing more than gratuitous overkill. I remember as a younger man watching Braveheart when it came out. And I watched it with my sister. And that film depicts battle pretty clearly. You know, it's violent, it's aggressive. I remember though that my sister used to watch that, she was okay with that, and then she used to turn away on a particular scene where the horses got killed. And I used to think to myself, this is a really odd response. Like, you're okay with watching the massive violence of the battles, but you don't want to watch the horse dying. Like, that seemed odd to me. Another film that plays on that sort of idea is the film Warhorse, which depicts a warhorse, a battle horse, during the First World War. And the main character of the film is a horse. And as battle is raging around this horse, people are dying in the trenches. You find yourself oddly caring about whether this horse lives or dies. You see, when we... And then, so it's even beyond that in the passage. It's not just that they kill the horse, or no, they don't. It's not just that they hamstring the horses. It's that God tells them to do it. And it just seems a bit much. You know, maybe we could understand the action of wounding the horses this way if it had been done sneakily before the battle as a tactic of war. So let's say Joshua and his men snuck into the enemy camp in the night and made the horses lame. That would make sense. Therefore, they're not going to be able to pull the chariots. Therefore, the might of the enemy is going to be diminished. These movable platforms which archers could fire from, which was a major battle weapon of the day and would decide victory based on it, well, they wouldn't have that anymore. It would make sense. But it wasn't done before the battle. The battle has been won at this point. Victory is Israel's. And now Joshua, acting on command of Yahweh, cuts the hamstrings of the horses. So what's going on and why does it matter? Well, when you hamstring a horse, it means to cut the main tendon that runs down the thigh muscle. Now this doesn't kill the horse, but it makes the horse lame for a season until the hamstring heals. Now, if you've ever had a hamstring injury, you will know how painful it is. Or, if you're a fan of football, you will know that if your star player gets a hamstring injury, it can end the season. Over time, however, that hamstring will heal. The hamstring will get strong again, and it will be able to handle the job. It will be able to handle the strength work. So, for instance, walking, pushing, all of these sorts of things the hamstring will be able to handle. But the hamstring will never be able to operate with fast, rapid acceleration like it once did. Put another way, these horses, which have not been killed, will be absolutely fine to be used for agricultural work, but they will never be suitable for war. So what's God doing here? See, what God's saying here is that now that Israel have moved from being the new kids on the block in the land to being the dominant power, they should take steps to not accumulate power for themselves or to trust in military might for their continued success. The horses and chariots were a source of great military might for the land. You know, the enemies, the northern kingdoms, their comfort was found in them. They slept well at night because they knew they were protected, and they used them to vanquish their foes. But God is saying to Israel, don't do it their way. Victory was brought to you through my miraculous power and your obedience to my word. Hamstring the horses so that you cannot be tempted to trust in them as your security. Now, we could look at many contemporary parallels for this principle. Ways of the world that we should not look to for our security. But there's one I would like to mention that I see increasingly prevalent in the Western Church, and that is the method of political coercion. You know, when the world around us wants to make people behave in a certain way, the method of doing so can be to use political coercion. What I mean by that is they seek election to places of power and then change laws that force people to act in a way that is counter to what they believe to be right. Now, this act is not inherently evil and is often done with very good intentions. In fact, very often, some of the laws I fully agree with. And I think that some things that have historically been unlawful should be made lawful, or vice versa. Or it could be that laws are brought in to protect the rights and freedoms of an oppressed people group, something that, as a Christian, I'm all in favour of. The issue in many respects is not what this coercion is used to achieve, but rather that it is the mechanism by which the world achieves it. I want to make that real clear. I'm not arguing with the political process, but I am recognising it is the mechanism of the world to see change occur. Go back to the time of Jesus, they faced a similar challenge. The mechanism by which power was levied was through military might and occupation. For hundreds of years, the way it was done was through power. The Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Romans, all ruled by establishing their man on the throne and surrounding him with an army. So when Jesus came, it's not surprising that the people thought the way to ensure his victory was to march on Jerusalem, establish Jesus onto the throne, surround him with an army, and take on the Romans. When the people observed Jesus, recognized that he was the promised Messiah, it records on several occasions that they tried to make him king by force, because their view was that's how we regain our inheritance. That's how we get our land back. That's how we get back to what we're meant to be. We do so through the power of the land. But Jesus wasn't having it. See, Jesus didn't achieve victory through their principles and processes, but through the kingdom way. He died for his oppressors, forgiving them as he did so. Now, what do we see the response of people of God to a worldview and legal system that can be moving increasingly away from kingdom principles? What do we see as the answer? Maybe some people would say, if we can get our guy into power, we can use the law to stop people being able to do things that are not in the kingdom. Maybe we could ban certain practices and force our way. Maybe we could take the might of those metaphorical horses and chariots and use them to defeat our enemies. Or maybe we can take power and surround our Christian leaders with armies, with protection. Again, pushing the law through to force a set of principles and behaviours onto people. Maybe that's the way that we establish kingdom rule in this country. But you know, this is not theoretical or hypothetical. That is what some people might think. But this is not a theoretical or hypothetical argument. This is exactly what we see in Western democracy. Followers of Jesus believing that the answer to the increasingly less Christian culture that they live in is to be in power. Because when you're in power, you make the decisions. And if you make the decisions, you can coerce people into your way. You know, as a military strategy, it ain't bad. But the problem is, it isn't the way of Jesus. Joshua was told to hamstring the horses so that his continued victory and security was found in God and in God's commands. Jesus went beyond this by achieving victory for all people under oppression, by dying for those who hated him. The way of Jesus is not one of accumulation of power, but one of humility, submission, trust, and above all, love. There may be other examples of how this principle plays out. Maybe to do with management structure that you have to live in, or family cultures that you exist under. There may be many situations where you will be tempted to work through the power game of the world in order to get on top, in order to see victory. I would encourage you to examine what structures and powers you put your security in, and to not then passively move away from them, but to hamstring them, to cripple them in your life, to make it so they cannot be what you put your security in, and then to put security in God. You know, we must be disciples of Jesus and not disciples of other systems, whether that be a political system or any other means of power. We must learn from our master, not from the master of people who don't know Christ. He must guide our actions. He must dictate our decisions. And it is the way of Jesus to fight for, defend, and protect the rights and freedoms of people who would seek to strip us of ours. If you disagree with that, I would really encourage you to go and read the Gospels and see how Jesus treats people who treat him badly. In Romans 5 it says that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. In doing so, our hearts were changed, and we are now no longer enemies of God, but we are called friends of God. You see, that is the order of God's kingdom. One where love overcomes adversary. His love for us defeated our adversary to him. As his followers, we should model our lives around his methods. We are called to win people for God by laying down our lives for those who would call us enemies. Now, there is a lot more in chapter 11 of Joshua. Stuff I don't really have time to go into. But if you would like to know anything more about the way of Jesus, or God's kingdom, or about us as a church, please get in touch with us or leave a comment. Thanks for listening.
We hope that you've been blessed by this message. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at www.kingschurchwirral.co.uk.